I'm Ted Brown. I'm one of the co-founders and board member of the Southwest Florida Reset Center. We make our home at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Fort Myers. We're a not-for-profit, and as most of you know, our aim is to work to mitigate the effects of global warming on climate, not only global warming, but other human effects which are affecting our environment. So I thought we could start by, since this is the first of what we hope will be a series, with a review of what we meant by the term reset. What do these letters stand for? The R stands for restoration. Restoration of the natural world, as much of it as we can influence from our place in Southwest Florida. That first E represents ecological, the principle that restoration reflects or results when we pay particular attention to the relationships between the various components of nature, the ecosystems which coexist in our environment. And so they're interconnected and they form patterns which we must be aware of. The S and the E represent the social and economic structures and incentives that shape our modern world. And many of those must be reimagined if we are going to be successful in doing our mission of transformation. That's the T, that's the hard part. What do we do to transform ourselves in such a way as to make amends for what has gone in the past and prevent future disasters? So this is the first in what we hope will be a series of conversations with people who are really on the leading edge of the way forward, people with strong records of advocacy and accomplishment, people from whom we can learn. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Steve Suau. Steve received his engineering degree at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. I have a great affinity for that place myself, having spent 37 years on the faculty there. Civil engineering at Illinois is a great department. It's in the top 5 departments in the world in civil engineering. And Steve also went on to Bradley University to receive an advanced degree in engineering administration. He spent the last 25 years of his life in Florida, where he's worked in both the private and public sectors with a special emphasis on and expertise in water management and water control and the quality of water. He's also highly respected for his expertise in matters relating to the soil and particularly remediation of the soil, the uses of carbon products to regenerate soil and to enhance its ability to produce food for us. Steve lives in Sarasota. So thanks, Steve, for being here today. And I hope that you'll start with a little bit of information for us about this recently published report from the Gulf Coast Foundation on it's called the Water Quality Playbook. That's an interesting name. Can you tell us about that, please, and what you think it might have to say for us down here in Southwest Florida?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. It's a pleasure to be with everyone. It feels like we're still virtual, but I was able to have lunch with a couple water friends today and hadn't seen them for over a year. And it was like, where were we? Well, where do we leave off when last we talked? So we're kind of picking things up, I think, from where we were before the pandemic. And I feel that one of those things was this water quality playbook that I had the honor to work on with the Gulf Coast Foundation here, which is really a model intended to be a model for coastal communities in Florida of how to better manage nutrients, understanding the sources better, and therefore understanding how we can cost effectively put our estuaries on a nutrient diet, as they say. We've got a lot of issues, I think, in Florida with excess nutrients and algae. Nutrients are a good thing. We all need them, but like anything else in excess, it can be a problem. So I'm going to share my screen here. I've got some visuals to share. So yeah, talking about the quality of Florida's waters, it's not good and it's getting worse. We've got probably over 50% of the water bodies now in the state of Florida are impaired for water quality. They're not meeting the standards, particularly for nutrients, but they're basically looking at it for a host of parameters. This is from the state's own database of what's now been designated by the state of Florida as being impaired for water quality. And the list seems to be growing every year. Several years ago, the state of Florida, after a long, protracted legal process with EPA, developed what's called numeric nutrient criteria. They actually set numbers for nitrogen and phosphorus. It was what was acceptable in the environment. They divided Florida up into several regions because Florida's hydrogeology is so diverse that one size doesn't necessarily fit all. You can see that in the area of the Caloosahatchee, the Brown area, and most of the peninsular Florida, those standards are 1.54 milligrams per liter for nitrogen and 0.12 for phosphorus. But when you get into the pink area of West Central, the total phosphorus concentration is 4 times higher than that. And the reason is that there's a predominance of a lot more phosphorus naturally in the environment. They're mining it, of course, up in Polk County, but the environment over the eons has adapted to it. But if you have those kind of concentrations elsewhere, it's a big problem. And it can be a big problem even in West Central Florida. One of the things that is important that I always point out is that even though the state of Florida has adopted numeric nutrient criteria, they have had that preceded that, and it survived, narrative numeric criteria. And the bottom line on that is basically that it says, in no case shall nutrient concentrations of a body of water be altered so as to cause an imbalance in natural populations of aquatic flora and fauna. So that's still pretty subjective and ambiguous, but the point that's important, I think, is that nutrients are a surrogate for healthy biology. It's really the biology of the waterways and the streams that is paramount and that we're trying to maintain, a life, if you will. So when we looked at the playbook, we kind of did a background of looking at what the various sources are, and a lot of these investigations would be similar for coastal communities. As I mentioned, in this region, it is already naturally rich in phosphorus, and as a result, you don't really need to be using any phosphorus fertilizer for landscapes. And the golf course industry, actually in this region, I interviewed quite a few of them. They seem to be, as an industry, pretty aware of this, and they typically don't use phosphorus fertilizer at golf courses in this part of the state. But homeowners don't need to either. What we saw in this region, and I think it's what we're seeing a lot of Southwest Florida, is over the past 20 years, nutrient levels are increasing. This is total nitrogen levels in Sarasota Bay over the past 20 years have increased about twofold. And so this is concerning because there's more nutrients out there in the bay to feed the various algae as a food source. And the concern is there was a workshop probably about a month ago that was put on by the estuary programs in the West Coast, Charlotte Harbor and Sarasota Bay and Tampa Bay. And the concern is that we're starting to see a lot more of this macroalgae, this floating algae, green cotton candy, or if you will, in the bays. And that is an early sign that there's something potentially wrong, because that will block sunlight. It will cause a loss in seagrass coverage. And we're seeing that in this part of the state. The report just came out. We've basically lost in Sarasota Bay about 20 years worth of seagrass growth. So this is really concerning. And the concern is that the macroalgae has nutrients in it that will be released. When they measure water quality, they typically only measure the nutrients in the water column and not in the algae that's present. As you add nutrients, that tends to increase the presence of macroalgae. And if you add enough nutrients, it can transpose into phytoplankton, and basically the whole system has changed dramatically. And I think there are areas over in the Indian River Lagoon where this has occurred. So there's concerns that we're starting to see early signs of this, and the estuary program folks on Southwest Florida are quite concerned about trying to get this turned around. And I wanted to talk about nitrogen. Nitrogen is the primary limiting nutrient in this part of the state. It'll be phosphorus in other parts, or it'll be both, frankly. But nitrogen is an interesting element, if you will. It makes up 78% of the atmosphere naturally, so it's the most common element in the atmosphere of what we breathe. But it's interesting in that, like water, it can exist as a gas, liquid, or solid. And like water, it can cycle, like the hydrologic cycle. It can exist in the environment, and it basically moves from the atmosphere through soil and plants on the earth and then back into the atmosphere. This natural process has been going on for eons, and there's basically bacteria that's able to pull the nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Nitrogen is a stable element in the atmosphere, but there is natural bacteria that can fix it or pull it out of the atmosphere and make it available in different forms for plants and animals. There's also bacteria that will convert the ammonia nitrogen into nitrite and nitrate, and yet other types of bacteria that will complete the cycle by converting nitrate back into nitrogen gas and put it back in the atmosphere and close the circle. One of the keys for this to happen is you need healthy soil to have the bacteria for that to happen. The German chemist Haber-Bosch figured out right before World War I, around that time, how to extract this stable nitrogen out of the atmosphere and make fertilizer. And as a result, by 1950, pretty much all the chemists had figured it out. And there's been an explosion really in pulling this stable nitrogen out of the atmosphere chemically and using it as fertilizer and putting it on our landscapes, on our farms. And we have a lot more of this nitrogen as a result that is in our waters and in our soils. That's one of the unintended consequences. The motivation for doing this was to grow more food. And the other unintended consequence is that farmers didn't have to pay attention as much to managing their soil and having the rich organic soil that would have the bacteria that would process nutrients like nitrogen naturally. So we've basically done the opposite as what we've done with CO2, where we've taken CO2 out of the ground and put it in the atmosphere. In the case of nitrogen, we pulled the nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put more and more of it in the planet. And that's why we're seeing so much of it in our waterways. This is not unique to Florida, of course. It's all over the country and all over the world, this phenomenon of too much nutrients that are causing algae blooms everywhere. Generally, the sources of nitrogen is, of course, fertilizer, as mentioned, and pretty much through the chemical process of the Haber-Bosch method. But there's also a lot of it potentially in the atmosphere that is deposited with dust and rain and in some areas snow. And then there's the range of nutrients that come from our waste, whether it's from on-site septic tanks or central wastewater treatment plants or the byproducts of biosolids. These are the primary sources of the form of nitrogen that's nitrate, and that is the form of ammonia nitrogen. Those are the forms of nitrogen that are instant food for plants and algae. Organic nitrogen takes a little while to break down, but when it's in these other forms, it's going to be used as instant food. It's like mainlining the algae. So we mentioned this community playbook. It has 10 various chapters that talk a lot about the different sources of the nutrients. And we used the Sarasota County region as kind of a model for doing a deep dive. But it's also got other ways to start managing those nutrients, whether it's monitoring, community partnerships, collaborations, doing stormwater management projects. So just a couple of aha moments, if you will, because I got to do I've been working in water management for over 35 years in Southwest Florida, but still this water quality thing, I don't think that we're very far advanced in how we're looking at and understanding and managing nutrients in the state or probably in the country. And I was able to do kind of a deep dive into a lot of the data and found things that I don't know if a lot of people are aware of, even some of the people that manage nutrients. And one of the first things was, of course, that not all wastewater treatment plants are created equal, particularly with respect to how well they reduce nutrients. So this, for example, is a graph, and this is all based on the data that these wastewater treatment plants have to submit to the state of Florida for their nitrogen concentrations. It would be similar for phosphorus, by the way. And you can see that the concentrations, their average concentration of total nitrogen varies quite significantly from one wastewater treatment plant to another. So it's all treated wastewater, and that's what the utilities will say, and that's what the politicians that they're told will say, but that doesn't mean that it's not rich in nutrients. The gold standard is what's called advanced wastewater treatment. That's the red line. Coincidentally, the city of Sarasota, and now I think the city of Venice, are meeting or exceeding that standard. And that's particularly advanced wastewater treatment is specifically additional processes to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients. Sarasota County has 3 plants that are some of the highest. They have already committed to move to advanced wastewater treatment. They're moving in that direction on the Bee Ridge plant, which is the highest nitrogen concentration, but they're also looking at converting their other 2 plants to advanced wastewater treatment. And part of that came out of the work that we did for the Gulf Coast, where we identified some of these things, and the commission have committed to do that. And it's a lot of money, but as it turns out, it's one of the most cost-effective investments that can be made in terms of reducing nitrogen or phosphorus. So if you look at how many dollars you spend per pounds of nitrogen or phosphorus reduced, going to advanced wastewater treatment for wastewater treatment plants is one of the most cost-effective things that can be done because you're addressing it at the source. Once that water gets out into the environment, it's a lot harder to address it. We're able to look at a lot of the septic tank areas as well. And fortunately, Sarasota County region has a ton of data, water quality data, flow data. So we're able to do a lot of analysis, and data at the end of the day, there's nothing more important for understanding water quality. And you need more than just a year or two. And they've got well over about 15 or 16 years of monthly data at many, many locations. So you start to see the trends and where the hot spots are, and then can look at what's near them and what might be causing that. It was incredibly important to have that. What we were able to determine, at least in this isolated area or region, is that there's a lot of septic tanks, and it does not appear that they're causing high nitrogen levels in the receiving waterway. We think that because of the hydrogeology in this region, there's a lot of what we call natural denitrification occurring in the soil. If there's any organic carbon in the soil, once the effluent gets into the water table and takes a long time to travel, there will be natural denitrification. And that's probably what's going on. Now, that's not going to be the case ever, certainly around the springs. So again, not all wastewater treatment plants are created equal. Not all septic tanks are created equal. It's really needs to be looked at on a site-specific basis, and because of Florida's diversity. I wanted to touch on atmospheric deposition real quickly, because this is a real success story. These maps contrast about a 20-year span, I believe, between how much nitrogen was being deposited from atmospheric deposition in the country, and you can see there's been a dramatic reduction. Turns out that under the Clean Air Act around 1995, a cap and trade program was set up to reduce air emissions for sulfur and nitrate in particular, and it's been very effective. So for coal fire plants, cement plants, that type of thing, there has been a program going on for 20 years to reduce those emissions. It came out of kind of the acid rain era, but it's been successful. And what remains now is mainly these hubs around the cities, the urban areas, which are probably associated with car emissions. So as we go to electric vehicles, we should get further reductions on that. Unfortunately, that's not the case for ammonia nitrogen. That's probably due to a lot of the feedlots where you're getting a lot of ammonia, and fertilizer, where you're getting volatilization of ammonia into the atmosphere. There appears to be kind of a correlation here. They're not as regulated. So that's a particular problem in the Midwest still. So those are some of the things that we found as we kind of went through a lot of the data. It'll be unique for each area if you look at the data, but most of this data is available. One of the things that was not available really that we'd like to, one of the recommendations to change was fertilizer sales have to be reported every month to, I think it's FDAC, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Community Services. And they're reported by what sector uses them, golf course, recreation, residential, and by county. Those used to be publicly available, and they're not anymore. We did a public records request and we're able to get 3 years of data just accumulated. And what we found from that data was it appears that some of these fertilizer ordinances are pretty effective in reducing fertilizer use. When we looked at the total pounds of fertilizer sales versus how much area could be irrigated, areas of golf courses and that kind of thing, it appeared that they were all pretty well below the recommended maximum for nitrogen application. But it would be really great to recommend, especially with new administration in the Department of Agriculture, to make these records public again. It would be really helpful for communities to understand that source and how much it is in their community, how much it may be contributing. And again, having data is really, really important, particularly water quality data, collecting that.
Thanks, Steve. One of the questions that comes to my mind is what role is played by using legumes and other plants that have the nitrogen fixing bacteria in the root systems? Where does that come into play in terms of reducing nitrogen overall in the whole cycle?
Regenerative agriculture, organic farmers will typically plant cover crops that are nitrogen fixers. One of the large organic farms, I think arguably one of the largest organic farm east of Mississippi, is actually in Charlotte County, Florida, Lady Moon Farms, and they move their operation up to Pennsylvania and Georgia this time of year, but they'll have planted sorghum to fix nitrogen in the soil. While they're gone, they'll be back in October, and so they'll have nitrogen available by doing that.
would you like to shift spotlight a little bit to talk about the effect of biochar and other carbon-based materials for treating water?
Yeah, so, in 35 plus years of doing this, one of the things, and you said I didn't really mention stormwater, because stormwater is what carries all these nutrients. It's not necessarily a source, but managing stormwater is critical to managing nutrients and improving water quality as well. So I wanted to touch on that real quick. Something that I've worked on for my entire career, I called it kind of healing watersheds, which is basically restoring a lot of what I call the signatures that are out on the landscape that have been overdrained. And 100 years ago, pretty much from this year, the state was in the middle of just an absolute obsession to drain the land. It wasn't just the Everglades, it was everywhere, right? And what we have found is by looking at historical aerials and the historical surveys. Florida became a state in 1845, and one of the first things that they did was had it all surveyed. And the surveyors, when they mapped each section, square mile, they would look at where watercourses crossed it and ended up mapping a lot of the creeks and waterways and wetland areas. And when you overlay that with historical signatures such as soils or habitat maps, they line up pretty well. And what we find in this area anyway, is a lot of the waterways did not extend very far. They were shallow tidal creeks, but over time, like I said, 100 years ago, those were extended, deepened to basically connect all of these low-lying swamps and marshes to drain them, primarily for agriculture, but also probably to a lesser extent, mosquito control. And by looking at where those intersect, a lot of those historical large sloughs and marshes are still out on the landscape that maybe have been pasture or agriculture. And we've looked a lot, and these are all over the state of Florida. I worked with the Florida Century Commission several years ago, and this is one of the recommendations we made, is to develop this blueprint, I would call it, for Florida, that identified where all these areas are still out there on the landscape, because they're easy to restore if you can add the water, get the water back in. So, for example, in Sarasota County, there's this large area. It was a sawgrass marsh. It was drained, but they grew celery instead of sugarcane. But ultimately, when I worked for Sarasota County as the stormwater director, we purchased the area and restored it as a large stormwater holding area and wetlands. The wildlife came back almost instantly, and it's also now co-managed by the Sarasota Audubon Society, but it's right off the interstate, a very, very popular birding and recreational facility as well, about 400 acres. But there's many stories like this that we've worked on and can continue to work on to try to go back and turn back the hands of time to drain them. I think they've now identified almost 300 different bird species since it was converted back. And similarly, even at a neighborhood scale, there's a gentleman in the community who became somewhat like a Pied Piper. He took compost material and yard waste, and he rebuilt the swale bank and didn't have to sod it or anything, but just by building up the organic carbon in there, in these banks, he was able to bring back some of the vegetation naturally and kind of restore the erosion. So this gets back to, like I was talking about, the celery fields and the over drainage of the landscape and the restoration of those kind of large areas. And then at a neighborhood scale, this is the normal swale along the roadway that was restored just by building the soil back up. The drainage ways in the community were typically maintained by the county. They were mowed, and all the vegetation would just drop to the bottom of the ditch, decomposed, turned to organics, release nutrients, and the ditch was basically devoid of life. It was just a green, stagnant area. The community went in with hip waders every Saturday morning, and they started cleaning it out, raking out the muck. And it was several feet deep. What they would do is they would rake it up on the banks of the ditch, add wood chips, and recreate a stable bank that could grow vegetation and plants again. But the real benefit was, and the return, I guess, on investment that the community saw, was that within days of cleaning this muck out and getting back down to the sandy bottom, the water would start flowing again. It would be clear. There would be crabs, there would be fish, there would be frogs, amphibians. Within days, life was restored within these drainage ways. So that's really, I think, why they did it. So that kind of community project, I think, is real beneficial in terms of trying to address this at a neighborhood scale even, because both scales are important, both the watershed and the regional. So talking about these organic carbon solutions, are pretty fascinating. I mean, that's really what nature is doing when you build soil. You're putting organic carbon in the soil, and that can do wonders by hosting different bacteria naturally. This is a farm in North Florida in this top left-hand picture. Very high nitrate concentrations in this stream due to nitrate in the fertilizer. So nitrate is soluble, it's flowing into the groundwater, into the stream, and it's coming out with very high nitrate levels. What was done in this particular case was a trench was dug along the vegetation line, upland of the vegetation line, and then that sand material was mixed with sawdust at about a 50-50 rate, put back into the ditch and filled back up. By doing that, what happens is you've added a carbon source that the water now has to flow through. And the water, again, is high in nitrate. So as a result, you're basically providing for the bacteria that uses that carbon as a food source. And the bacteria that we call denitrification bacteria removes the nitrating and converts it back into the atmosphere. The testing results, and this is from the University of Florida, we're seeing about, I think it was about a 60% reduction in nitrate. They conservatively estimate that the life of this thing will be 15 years. I think it's actually a little longer than that. Once you get organic carbon into an anaerobic environment, it becomes pretty stable. It doesn't decompose nearly as rapidly. But the real eye-opener to me was that the cost per pound of nitrogen removed was only 36 cents per pound. So to put that into perspective, when the Water Management District in our region evaluates a project for whether they're going to help fund it or not, they use about, I think it's about $175 per pound of nitrogen removed. So this is incredibly cost effective. And once it's done and covered up, the land is as usable as it was beforehand. The other organic carbon source that we've worked with is called biochar. It's essentially organic matter that is heated without oxygen or very little oxygen, so it turns it into charcoal instead of ash. And when you turn it into charcoal, it's essentially very high in carbon content, so it's very stable. It doesn't decompose rapidly as carbon life. So they discovered this type of material in South America along some of the river basins of the Amazon and realized that they were anthropogenic. They had pieces of pottery and bone in them. They believed that ancient cultures used to bury their waste in pits, and somehow they were able to heat it and cover it. So it turned it into this black material. They call it terra preta, and it can grow. It's incredibly rich soil. So they're able to grow quite a bit of pretty good yields out of this. That's how they believe they were able to sustain populations. The soils normally in the Amazon, kind of like in Florida, are sandy, and all the rain leaches them of minerals and nutrients. But this is a way to hold them. And it's still there. And these deposits are still there probably hundreds, if not thousands of years after they were put in place. I realized after getting involved in this that it's kind of what nature does during a burn. It basically, if you go out after a controlled burn or natural burn, the pine trees and palmettos are charred. The flames have gotten up high, there's very little oxygen in the base, and they basically char the bases of the pine trees and the palmettos. And that's basically nature's way of putting carbon back into the soil. And that's why they kind of rejuvenate so quickly. The other unique thing with biochar is when you look at it under a microscope, it is just full of voids and pores. The surface area to this is incredible. We've tested a lot of it and actually developed a particular type of biochar to absorb phosphorus, and it holds a lot of water. So that's one of the advantages. The main interest in it is as a soil amendment because of what they found down in the Amazon. The amount of university research on this biochar in the last 5 years has just increased exponentially. University of Florida is probably one of the leading universities on looking at it for cleaning water, particularly wastewater. But University of Illinois, my alma mater, has also been looking at it quite a bit, as well as for a soil amendment. But it's being looked at mainly for a soil amendment. But we've tested a lot of it. We have a large ranch client that was interested in using this to clean wastewater and removing nutrients, and the Water Management District was very interested as well. So they're working together. We just finished a project that's about 3 acre that uses both wood chips for nitrogen removal and then biochar for phosphorus uptake. We developed with the University of Florida, as I mentioned, a particular type of biochar that will absorb nitrogen. It appears that it doesn't need much contact time. In about In about 15 to 20 minutes, we're getting probably close to 80% removal of phosphorus, but it probably doesn't last as long as the wood chips. We may have to replace that every year or so. But it could be used as a soil amendment, because what we found is once biochar is loaded with nutrients, and that's what you really need to do with it, you need to load it or inoculate it with microbes and nutrients. It tends to hold on to them in all these nooks and crannies. It's like a soil reef, if you will, for microbes. There's so much life in this stuff that it will act as a slow release fertilizer. So we've been working with both these materials in different applications, using them in stormwater ponds, using them in trenches around embayments where there's high nitrate, and then using this up in Lakewood Ranch to remove nitrogen and phosphorus from some of the wastewater that comes in from the county that does not meet that advanced wastewater treatment standard. That's what we're trying to get to. So we're actually having it delivered there. We're running it through these basins to remove the nitrogen, phosphorus, to get them down to advanced wastewater treatment before we send it out for irrigation in the community.
Well, Steve, that's really exciting stuff. I think maybe we should pause here and see what sorts of items have been put into our chat box. Gary Robbins will handle some of those. Gary, are you ready to take over?
I am indeed, Ted. Thank you so much. Where does the funding come from to cover the cost of advanced water treatment?
Oh, great question. It primarily comes from the utilities and the utility customers.
Is there state funding of any kind to help cover that?
Not that I'm aware of. The Water Management District has started to debate whether or not they should help fund those things. And I think that's a really good discussion for them to have, because it is such a cost-effective public investment when you compare it to everything else. And there's been a lot of studies on this. I've got a lot of the numbers. It would seem to me that whether it's the district's money or tax money from the district or from local government, that would be a good investment for the district to help local government and counties and municipalities upgrade to advanced wastewater treatment.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Do you think it is possible, Steve, for the state of Florida to have a maximum daily load that is enforceable?
Well, they're all supposed to be enforceable. I think that's the problem. It's an overwhelming situation that's been created to try to correct those. You know, the current regulatory program, and for example, they're upgrading the stormwater rules right now, and I've been following that. But the current regulatory program seems to be designed to the point of failure. So it's more reactive than it is proactive. And then once you've tipped that point and the area becomes impaired, means they have to set a TMDL, and now it's up to the public to correct that problem. And that's what I'm saying. At that point, it's much more expensive to remove nitrogen, phosphorus once the chocolate is in the milk, if you will, than it is to try to address it at the source, say a wastewater treatment plant. So this is all expensive. But so then you start to look at, well, what's the most cost-effective investment that the public can make? Get it at the source.
Okay. Oh, a copy of the community playbook. How do people get a copy of that, Steve?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a web-based document. I'll make sure to send the link as well that you'll have. You can probably find it by the Gulf Coast Community Foundation website, but I'll make sure that you have the link.
Fantastic.
We're starting to work with communities on actually trying to implement some of the recommendations of it, like some of the coastal communities up here. City of Holmes Beach is interested. I'd like to talk to the city of Venice about it as well.
Can you give an estimate of how much the advanced water treatment costs? How do you look at that cost as opposed to what we currently might be doing, and what's the benefit?
Oh, you mean advanced wastewater treatment?
Yes, advanced wastewater treatment.
Yeah, there's been studies, and I've looked at it for some of the Sarasota County plants. The range, I would say, is between $11 and $70 per pound of nitrogen removed. And that's how that's the basis of comparison that I unitize things in to compare one thing to another. Stormwater management projects typically run in the neighborhood of $200 per pound of nitrogen. You saw that denitrification trench that was dug up around the farm. That was cents. That was, I think, 39 cents per pound of nitrogen, which is extremely cost effective. So relatively speaking, it depends on the plant. So there'll be a range, but I've seen the numbers around $11 to $70 per pound of nitrogen reduced.
Okay. How would you suggest we be able to help out with lowering nutrient loading from cattle ranches?
I didn't get into a little bit of the work that I'm working on with local Progressive Caucus and Reset on identifying different sustainable agricultural operations, which include composting, include food distributorships, as well as the farms. And there's a lot of those in our region. And if we can identify them and the community can start advocating for them, where the point where their demand goes up and they become at a point where they have to hire more people and we can expand their markets, that's kind of what we need to do. And I'm sorry, Gary, I don't think that answered your question, but I can't remember what the question was.
Okay. Question, how would you suggest we be able to help out with lowering nutrient loading from cattle ranches?
Yeah, okay. So cattle ranches, I visited a cattle ranch last year and I asked them that very question: how do you fertilize? And what they showed me was, and I took a picture of it, they basically chained a bunch of large tractor tires together. And the tractor tires are laid flat on the ground, and they basically pull that through the pasture to spread the manure. And that's what they do. So they don't fertilize. And I'm not saying that cattle ranchers don't fertilize. I'm saying there's other options that they can use to recycle the nutrients that are already there, as in manure. I think a lot of the problem in the center of the state is, for years it was used as the depository for all the wastewater biosolids that were hauled from the east and west coast out into the middle of nowhere and spread, and that's caused a lot of problems too. But that practice has been changed and needed to. But the cattle ranches are not, when you talk about agriculture, it's mainly the conventional agriculture that's applying fertilizer. And the good news, I think, is last year, we're working with a big composting operation that's building a facility in Charlotte County, not far from Lady Moon Farms, the big organic farm, by the way. And when we met with them, they had a citrus grower from the Ridge, conventional citrus grower, in the meeting. And he said that the citrus industry is literally fighting. This was his words. We're literally fighting over this material. And the reason is that they're spending so much money on chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, and those costs keep going up, that they're putting more money in per acre than they can get out in a yield. So the revelation they've had is, if we go back to building soil, then we don't need as many or as much of these chemicals, and therefore we can start making money again. And then he went on to say, and this was probably the most important thing, was that in his opinion, if the state of Florida were smart, they would cost share farmers building or rebuilding soil, because it would reduce water use and it would reduce fertilizer and nutrient runoff. And I think he's absolutely right. And the state already does, at least this water management district and FDACs, they will reimburse a farmer if they reduce their groundwater pumping, invest in water conservation, or recycling surface water for irrigation. Anything they do that reduces their groundwater pumping, because they're trying to reduce that in this region for resource reasons, the state of Florida will reimburse the farmer 50% of the cost. So that type of thing is not unprecedented in Florida. And I think rebuilding soil with agriculture would be a win on many levels. It's not just reducing water use and chemical fertilizer use. It's giving us more sustainable farms, more sustainable food. It's also sequestering carbon at the same time. Yeah. So there's a lot of wins in doing that. And I'd love to talk to our current agriculture commissioner about that.
Well, this is a great point at which to break in and say we've run out of time. Gosh, that's a great ending, Steve. I think that you've opened up another door to look at, maybe come back another time and talk about that, because that's one of the areas that we really need to focus on. Thanks again for a wonderful presentation today. I'm going to turn this over to Holly.
Thank you, Tim.
And Holly is going to close us out with a few words about the program to come ahead. Holly, it's all yours.
Thank you. So I really thank you all so much for attending. This is the first in our series of Reset Conversations. And next month, on Wednesday, June 9th, the same time, 3:00 p.m., we will be speaking with Marco Acosta, who I see has been here. And Marco is a FGCU food forest manager, and he has a background in conservation management and a degree in environmental horticulture. We've been loving getting to know both Marco and Alex and Nikesh. And Alex is an adjunct professor of Integrated Studies at Florida Gulf Coast University. And Alex and Marco are going to tell us what the heck a food forest really is. What is a food forest and the permaculture principles that food forests are based on. And just so you all know, Reset Center is partnering with Florida Gulf Coast University Department of Sustainability in planning a food forest at the UUCFM, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Fort Myers, where we have 12.5 acres of eco-preserve here and already established a community garden. So we're hoping that with their help and a couple of grants that we're going to be able to establish a permaculture demonstration and food forest here on this campus where I'm streaming to you from. So I just want to thank you all again for attending. And I'm not shy in asking this because we've never asked anybody yet. But if you would like to make a financial contribution to Southwest Florida Reset Center efforts, you can do that through our website, and I'll put that link in the chat right now. And I just want to thank you all so much for coming, because it's going to take all of us to solve our water problems. And we at Reset know that if we don't get how we grow our food right, we're never going to get the water clean. So one thing really complements each other. So thank you all for coming. And please check out our Facebook and our website pages. So thank you, everybody, and namaste.